In 1971, the American muscle car was supposed to be dying. The rules were tightening, emission standards were getting tougher, compression ratios were falling, insurance companies were punishing big-engine cars, and inside General Motors, the old horsepower war was starting to look like a very expensive problem. Then Pontiac did something that made almost no sense. It took a massive 455 cubic inch V8, gave it low compression, strange-looking round port heads, a relatively mild hydraulic cam, and a 4-barrel carburetor, and somehow turned it into one of the most memorable engines of the entire muscle car era. This was the Pontiac 455 HO, and here's the shocking part. It wasn't supposed to happen. Pontiac was already being squeezed by GM's corporate rules. The legendary Ram Air engines were disappearing. High compression was becoming harder to justify, and the era of giant, high-strung V8s seemed to be coming to an end. But Pontiac engineers weren't ready to surrender. What they created wasn't the most powerful engine Pontiac ever built. It wasn't even the highest revving. It was something more interesting. It was an engine designed to keep the muscle car alive after the rules had already started killing it. And most people have no idea how clever that engine really was. To understand the 455 HO, you have to go back to the end of the 1960s. Pontiac had built its reputation on engines like the 400 Ram Air 3 and the legendary Ram Air 4. These engines relied heavily on compression, aggressive camshafts, high-flow cylinder heads, and the ability to make power at higher RPM. The Ram Air 4, for example, ran compression ratios over 10.5 to 1. It breathed through radical round port heads. It used a solid lifter camshaft, and it was designed to pull hard all the way to redline. That was the formula that worked in 1969 and 1970. The streets were filled with GTOs, Firebirds, and Transams that could embarrass nearly anything on the road. Pontiac had become synonymous with performance. But by 1971, the game had changed. GM imposed an 8.5 to 1 corporate compression limit for the new model year, largely to accommodate changing fuel and emissions requirements. Suddenly, Pontiac couldn't simply raise compression and squeeze more power from the same displacement. The engineers were stuck. They couldn't build another Ram Air 4. They couldn't ignore corporate mandates. And they couldn't just give up. The performance division that had defined Pontiac's identity was at a crossroads. So the engineers went in another direction. If they couldn't make the engine more powerful by squeezing harder, why not make it breathe better and make it bigger? The answer was 455 cubic inches. The engine measured approximately 4.15 inches in bore and 4.21 inches in stroke. That long 4.21-inch stroke was important because it gave the 455 enormous leverage at low and mid-range RPM. This wasn't a tiny, screaming race engine. It was a giant torque machine, and Pontiac didn't just drop the regular 455 into a performance car and call it done. The HO received special round port cylinder heads, an aluminum intake manifold, a Rochester Quadrajet 4-barrel, large branch exhaust manifolds, and Pontiac's famous 068 hydraulic camshaft. That cam used approximately 288 degrees of advertised intake duration and 302 degrees on the exhaust side, with roughly 0.410 and 0.413 inches of lift. Those numbers don't sound terrifying today. That was the point. Pontiac wasn't trying to build an engine that sounded like a race car at 7,000 revolutions per minute. It was building an engine that could make serious power while still surviving street use. The hydraulic lifters meant no valve adjustments. The Quadrajet meant excellent street manners and surprisingly good fuel economy when driven gently. The relatively mild cam timing meant the engine would idle cleanly and run on pump gas without complaint. This was engineered compromise, the kind of engineering that showed real maturity. And then came the number everyone remembers, 335 horsepower. At least, that's how the 1971 engine was rated under the old gross horsepower system. It also produced 480 pound-feet of gross torque. But there's an important detail hidden inside those numbers. GM was transitioning to SAE net horsepower ratings, which measured engines closer to their real-world installed configuration. Under the newer system, the 455 HO was rated around 310 net horsepower in the GTO and roughly 305 net horsepower in the Firebird application. Same basic engine, different measurement, and that difference would eventually make the 455 HO look weaker on paper than it really was. But there was a much bigger problem. The compression ratio was only about 8.4 to 1. For a muscle car engine in 1971, that sounded almost embarrassing. Just 2 years earlier, Pontiac was building engines with compression ratios nearly 3 points higher. Enthusiasts were used to seeing numbers like 10.75 to 1 or even higher. Now Pontiac was asking them to get excited about 8.4 to 1. It was a hard sell, especially when competitors were still advertising higher numbers. So how could an engine with compression that low compete with the monsters Pontiac had built only a few years earlier? The answer was airflow. The HO heads were derived from Pontiac's high-performance round port architecture. The ports were designed to move air efficiently, and the exhaust side was dramatically better than the ordinary 455. The exhaust system used larger head pipes, and on Firebirds, the functional ram air system could pull cooler outside air into the engine through the shaker or hood system. That ram air system wasn't just for show, it actually worked. Cooler air meant denser air, which meant more oxygen for combustion. Pontiac was basically fighting physics with airflow. And it worked. The 455 HO wasn't a high RPM monster. It didn't need to be. With 455 cubic inches and a 4.21-inch stroke, it could hit hard without needing to spin like a small block. That meant the engine felt brutally strong the moment the throttle opened. You didn't have to wait for 5,500 revolutions per minute. The torque was already there. Peak torque arrived at just 3,600 revolutions per minute. That's barely above idle by modern standards. But it meant the engine delivered maximum thrust exactly where you needed it on the street. In traffic, merging onto highways, passing slower cars, the 455 HO was always ready. And then Pontiac put this engine into some of the most dramatic cars it had ever built. The 1971 Firebird Trans Am, the GTO, and for a very short time, the final Pontiac GTO Judge. The Judge itself was already on borrowed time. Only 357 were built for 1971, including just 17 convertibles. The 455 HO was part of the final chapter of a car that had helped define the muscle car explosion only a few years earlier. That wasn't coincidence. The entire era was closing. The Judge's wild graphics and spoilers suddenly seemed like relics of a different time, but Pontiac wasn't finished. In fact, the 455 HO was just getting started. Put yourself behind the wheel of a 1971 GTO. You turn the key, the starter kicks the giant V8 over. The engine catches. There's no screaming race car idle. Instead, there's that deep, heavy Pontiac rumble. The exhaust note is thick and authoritative. You can feel the engine's mass through the steering wheel. The whole car vibrates with a kind of mechanical presence that smaller engines can't replicate. You ease into the throttle, the Quadrajet opens, the 455 responds, and suddenly almost 3,900 pounds of American steel is moving with a kind of effortless force that smaller engines simply couldn't duplicate. There's no drama, no wheel spin if you're careful, just this immense, unstoppable forward surge. The car doesn't feel fast in a frantic way. It feels inevitable. A 1971 GTO with the 455 HO 4-speed transmission and 3.90 rear axle was tested by Motor Trend at around 6.1 seconds from 0 to 60 miles per hour and 13.4 seconds through the quarter mile at roughly 102 miles per hour. Remember what that means. This was 1971. The muscle car was supposedly finished, yet Pontiac had an engine capable of pushing a full-size GTO through the quarter mile in the low 13. And that wasn't even the strangest part. The 455 HO was still running a hydraulic cam. It still had cast iron heads. It still used a production-based 4-barrel carburetor. It was still designed to be driven to the grocery store. You could order air conditioning with it. You could get power windows. You could spec an automatic transmission if you wanted. You could equip it with radial tires and power steering. That was Pontiac's secret weapon. It wasn't a race engine pretending to be a street engine. It was a street engine with enough hardware to behave like something much more serious. It was the best of both worlds at a time when most manufacturers were giving up on performance entirely. But then 1972 arrived, and this is where the story gets even more interesting. The 455 HO survived. Pontiac made relatively few changes. The engine still displaced 455 cubic inches. The bore and stroke remained approximately 4.15 by 4.21 inches. Compression stayed around 8.4 to 1. The 068 camshaft architecture remained part of the formula, but the cylinder heads changed to the 7F6 casting. The Quadrajet calibration changed. The emissions equipment became more extensive, and the horsepower number suddenly dropped, 300 horsepower. At first glance, it looked like Pontiac had lost 35 horsepower in a single year, but that wasn't really what happened. The biggest change was the measurement system. The 1971 figure people remember was a gross rating. The 1972 figure was SAE net. The engine hadn't suddenly become useless. It was still producing approximately 415 pound-feet of net torque at around 3,200 revolutions per minute. And that's the number that tells the real story, 415 pound-feet, at only 3,200 revolutions per minute. This engine didn't need to scream, it simply shoved. That was the personality of the 455 HO, and Pontiac knew exactly what it was doing. The company put it in the 1972 Trans Am, where the engine was paired with the famous shaker hood. You could literally see the intake system moving with the engine as the big V8 worked underneath it. It looked aggressive, it sounded aggressive, but underneath the hood was an engine built around compromise. Low compression, huge displacement, good cylinder heads, efficient airflow, a relatively conservative camshaft, and enormous torque. That combination was becoming increasingly rare, because by 1972, the world around Pontiac was changing rapidly. Safety regulations were adding weight, emissions equipment was becoming more complicated, fuel requirements were changing, insurance rates were punishing high-performance cars, and sales of traditional muscle cars were collapsing. Buyers were moving towards smaller cars. The government was preparing stricter regulations. The insurance industry was making big engine cars nearly uninsurable for young drivers. The cultural moment that had created the muscle car was disappearing. Pontiac could build the engine. The question was whether anyone would still buy the car. The numbers tell the story. In 1971, only 2,116 Trans Ams were produced with the 455 HO, according to commonly cited production records. In 1972, the number fell to just 1,286. That's not mass production, that's survival. And then something almost unbelievable happened. The 1972 model year was cut short by a major United Auto Workers strike at GM's Norwood plant, further reducing Firebird production. The muscle car era wasn't just fading, it was being strangled from multiple directions at once. Yet the 455 HO refused to disappear quietly, and this is where the engine's legacy becomes more complicated. Because technically, calling it the last true muscle car engine isn't completely accurate. Pontiac followed it with something even more serious. The 1973 and 1974 Super Duty 455. That engine was stronger, more heavily engineered, and became the ultimate survivor of Pontiac's performance era. It used forged pistons, it had stronger connecting rods, it received a more aggressive camshaft, it had better valve springs and a more robust valvetrain. And it represented Pontiac's absolute final statement in the muscle car world. But the 455 HO occupies a special position. It was the bridge. It connected the old muscle car world to the world that was coming next. It was Pontiac's answer to a problem that seemed impossible. How do you keep making a big performance V8 when compression is being cut, emissions regulations are tightening, insurance costs are rising, and the entire industry is preparing to slow down? You build a giant engine that doesn't depend entirely on compression. You give it better heads, you give it the right camshaft, You make the intake and exhaust breathe, and you use displacement to recover what the regulations took away. That's the shocking truth behind the 455 HO. It wasn't powerful because Pontiac ignored the new rules. It was powerful because Pontiac learned how to work around them. And that makes the engine more impressive, not less. The 455 HO represented a completely different philosophy from the high-compression engines of the late 1960s. Those engines were about making power through compression and RPM. The 455 HO was about making power through cubic inches and airflow. The difference was enormous, and it changed how Pontiac approached performance for the rest of the decade. Its 4.21-inch stroke gave the crankshaft serious leverage. Its round port heads improved breathing. The 068 camshaft kept the valve timing aggressive enough for performance without turning the engine into a temperamental race motor. And the Quadrajet gave Pontiac something else that mattered on the street: drivability. That was crucial, because this wasn't a dragster. It had to idle. It had to cruise. It had to start in cold weather. It had to survive traffic. It had to run on regular pump gas. And then, when the driver buried the throttle, it had to deliver. That balance is why the 455 HO became so important. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the most powerful Pontiac V8. It wasn't the strongest engine Pontiac would build. And it certainly wasn't the end of performance. But it arrived at exactly the moment when performance was becoming politically, economically, and mechanically difficult. That's what makes it special. Think about the timing. 1970 had given America some of the wildest muscle cars ever built. The LS6 Chevelle, the Hemi Cuda, the Ram Air 4 GTO, the Boss 429 Mustang, the 446-pack Super Bee. These were engines built without apology, raw, unfiltered performance. By 1971, compression was falling. By 1972, the horsepower ratings were changing. By 1973, federal emissions requirements and the new 5 miles per hour bumper standards were reshaping cars. Then came the 1973 oil crisis. Gas prices skyrocketed. Fuel economy became a national obsession. The big engine party was ending. Pontiac's Super Duty 455 would keep the flame alive for another 2 years, but the old world was already disappearing. The 455 HO was one of the last engines created before that door slammed shut, and that's why collectors still obsess over it. Because when you open the hood of an original 455 HO car today, you're not just looking at a 455, you're looking at a snapshot of the final days of American muscle. An engine that shouldn't have worked as well as it did, an engine with only 8.4-to-1 compression that could still deliver massive torque, an engine that carried technology from the legendary Ram Air era into a completely different regulatory environment, and an engine that proved Pontiac wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet, not without one final fight. The most important lesson is simple. The 455 HO didn't survive because Pontiac had unlimited freedom. It survived because Pontiac engineers had almost none. They couldn't rely on huge compression. They couldn't simply spin the engine faster. They couldn't ignore emissions. They couldn't pretend the world wasn't changing. So they used what they still had: displacement, airflow, camshaft design, cylinder head efficiency, and torque. Massive, relentless, low RPM torque that could move a heavy car with authority. The result was one of the last great Pontiac V8s of the classic muscle car era. And perhaps that's why the 455 HO still feels different today. It wasn't born during the golden age. It was born at the end of it, when the celebration was already over, when the industry was already walking away, when the accountants were already winning. The 455 HO wasn't the beginning of Pontiac's muscle car story. It was the defiant final chapter before the rules changed everything. And maybe that's what makes it so unforgettable. Because when the industry started telling Pontiac that the muscle car was finished, Pontiac didn't answer with a smaller engine. It didn't answer with excuses. It didn't give up and build economy cars. It answered with 455 cubic inches, with round port heads, with functional ram air, with a shaker hood that moved every time the engine breathed. and with enough torque to remind everyone that Pontiac still knew how to build an engine that mattered. That defiance is what makes the 455 HO legendary. Not the horsepower numbers, not the quarter-mile times, but the refusal to quit when quitting was the easy answer. The refusal to accept that performance was dead. The absolute determination to keep building something that mattered, even when the world was moving on. If you enjoyed this deep dive, let me know what forgotten engine should come next. Another Pontiac legend? A Chrysler monster? Or one of the Ford engines that almost changed the entire horsepower war? And make sure you subscribe, because some of the most interesting engines in American history weren't the ones that won the most races. They were the ones that refused to die.